I'll let you go ahead and get your screen up while I introduce you. So we are welcoming Irina, who holds a PhD of History and Viking Studies from the University of Bucharest. Irina is an independent researcher and history teacher based in Germany and contributes to the Save Ancient Studies Alliance and the Ancient History Encyclopedia. And we can see your screen.
Is it moving?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction as well. My topic for today regards magic swords in a particular kind of Icelandic sagas in the Fornaldarsögur. These would be the legendary sagas, so they're sagas written in the 13th, 14th century, even later on, but sagas which deal with material, especially during the migration period, so during the 5th to 6th century. My topic involves the concepts of agency and animacy, as well as personhood, and my interest in the topic stems from the abundance of magical objects populating popular culture nowadays, and the fact that they do not only seem symbolic and functional, but also with a personality of their own. And we have perhaps the most classical example from the work of J.R. Tolkien, and whereas he speaks of a lot of magical objects. One in particular came to my mind due to the topic, and that was the Sword of Aragorn, the Narsil, which was remade into Anduril, the Flame of the West. And as you can see here in the description, we have a couple of elements which can suggest the fact that this sword had a personality of its own, which is a thing that we also can find in Old Norse literature. So the forging by elves or dwarves, in Tolkien's case, it's about the elves, and then some kind of properties like the fact that it shines like a sun or that it shines like embers and so on and so forth. So this is what I'm going to detail here, using a theoretical framework regarding the new theory of things or thingness. This theory has to do with the weakening of the traditional Western dichotomy between animate and inanimate, which gives us a new sense of the sensibility and power of things, because such polarities like between signifier and signified prove to be too limiting for describing processes of exchange, adoption, or cultural transformation. We first have some ideas about consumption, collection, and possession as social acts with the work of Arjuna Padurai in the 1980s. But then this theory of thingness developed with the connections with the specific landscape, a more holistic approach nowadays, or things as a matter of concern in themselves. In other words, materiality started being interpreted as agency, and this would be beyond the theory of the Marxist commodity fetishism. There is a new concept in literature regarding thingness, which is the dynamic flow of matter from bodies to objects and vice versa, and this would be derived from the present complexities of interconnected things, like the way people relate to things nowadays and the way things transform people and vice versa, like mutual transformation. We do have Bourdieu here to develop the idea for objects as signs of distinction and consuming them as a sign of power, because as we know from many civilizations, elites consolidate their power with objects, but things themselves can speak to and get entangled in diverse stories and influence social relationships, for example, when collecting or buying or giving gifts or inheriting. So this presumes the fact that new meanings and an ongoing agency between people and objects is forged. Dealing with objects seems at first to be determined by a functional aspect, but things are also appreciated because of their inherent ideas, because of what they get to represent in their history. They have their own social and individual values, which grow through anthropomorphic projections. So basically they're turned into people, personified, rather than simply practical functions or even social functions of material worth. objecthood and anthropomorphic projections are united in a liaison with vivid reciprocity, as we are going to see in the examples I gathered from Old Norse literature. And in this story, we don't only have agency at work, but also animacy, the idea of living systems as organizationally closed entities is basically rejected nowadays in this new theory of things, and on the contrary, living systems are perceived as more as hybrid systems, as a fuzzier approach to the idea of objects versus people. No, they're gathered together in one system. For example, you have things like implants nowadays, or perhaps a more mundane example, the communication means like the smartphone, which is basically integrated in our own ecology. So conjunctions like someone with their weapon or using their weapon involve not only interdependence, but also a question of boundaries. Is it the simple physics of the weapon, or can the weapon actually be isolated as an objective, a social fact? And according to this theory, weapons cannot be isolated as merely objective things. And in Old Norse literature, we have a couple of examples of swords, of legendary swords, which can fit very well into this theory. We have first and foremost the sword Tyrfing. The sword Tyrfing was used in a couple of sagas, but the best known saga dealing with it is the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. It was a saga translated by Christopher Tolkien, the son of J.R. Tolkien, by the way. And in the original story, in one of the versions of Hervara Saga, we have Svavarlami, who is Odin's grandson, who traps two dwarves, Dvalin and Durin, and then a sword is forged with a golden hilt that would cut through stone and never miss a hit. And there is a curse linked to this sword, which is to commit 3 evil deeds, which from the very start induces the idea of agency. Svavarlami was killed by the berserker Angrim, who took then the sword in his turn, and after Angrim, it was worn by Angantyr, a berserker, and his who had some deeds with his 11 brothers. They were all slain in the magical place known as Samsö by the Swedish champion Hjalmar, and then the sword gets into the possession of the daughter Hervor, and there is a very famous poem where she basically wakes up her father from her sleep of death, the waking of Angantyr, and the shield maiden really wants the sword because she considers it to be the rightful inheritance. Now, the 3 swords, the 3 deeds, evil deeds, the sword commits. First of all, the champion Hjalmar is wounded by Angantyr's company at Samsö. The second deed would be that Heidrek killed his brother Angantyr after receiving it as a gift from their mother. That would be the older version and the most compelling of them. There is also a newer version where he kills his brother with a stone, but also somehow related to the sword, because he gets the sword afterwards as well, not as a reward, but as a means to protect him in the future. However, this does not happen because he is slain by his own thralls while carrying the sword. Nevertheless, this object does stay in the family and seems to have a special link to this family. And like I said, the most compelling episode with the sword, to my mind, is the one in the older version where Heidrek gets the sword from his mother, and then he gets mad somehow and then kills his brother. So the story says that he drew the sword, and with a very compelling description that is shown brightly and glittered, and then when he screamed loudly, he went into a rage, into the berserker gang, and because the 2 brothers were not really on good terms, Tyrfing acted in a way that Heidrek basically struck his brother with the death blow. So it kills when it is drawn. It has a potency However, this potency cannot be actualized without intent. And with regards to this particular episode, there is always the dwelling question: was Heidrek willing to do that, or was the sword pushing him to do that, or was it actually both of them who had some kind of intention, and then the boundaries between them get blurred and they perform the act together? So is it bloodlust compelling to act, or is it the object in itself? The object basically challenges the unity of the self, because the personality dissolves once in touch with the blade. It prompts Heidrek to kill when it comes in physical contact with him. And so that you can see a little bit from the description of the sword and how it gets a little bit humanized. I'm going to quote a little bit from the newer version of the story. So Tyrfinger het og allra var bitras og hvert sin en því far brugðið, þó listi á svo sem af sólargeisla. Aldrei mátti hann svo hafa berran að eigi yrði hans manni bani og með vormublóði skildi hann jafnan slíðra. En ekki var það kvikt, hvorki menn ne kvikvendi lifa mætti til annars dags, en sår fekk af honum hvort sem var meira eða minna. Aldrei hafði hann brugt í sig hogi eða staðar numit, fyrir hann kom í jörð og svo maður en hann orustu mundi sigur få ef honum var vegið. Þetta sverd frekt í allum forsögum. So it basically says that Tyrfing is the keenest of all swords. Every time it was drawn, a light shone from it. Like a ray of sun, it could never be held unsheathed without being the death of someone, and it had always had to be sheathed with blood still warm upon it. There was no living thing, neither man nor beast, that could live to see another day if they were wounded by Tyrfing, whether the wound were big or little. Never had it failed in a stroke or been stayed before plunged into the earth, and the man who bore it in battle will always be victorious if blows struck with it. And this sword was renowned in all ancient tales, and that is actually true because we have a couple of more examples. For example, in the Saga of Arrow-Odd, where Tyrfing again appears in this position of being made by the dwarves, and it would bite anything. So this is something you're going to find very often in the legendary sagas, the sword that can bite through anything. Which is also the case of Gram from the Volsunga saga. Gram is the superior sword of Sigmund the Volsung. It is a gift from Odin as well. And it is used to perform a lot of great deeds in the saga. It was pulled from a tree, remade, tried and tested. So we have this idea of the old sword being capable of greatness, and of the harmony between the potency of the sword and the potency of the hero. So in both cases, we have endurance and strength. It is the only sword to withstand the trials because Sigurd, the son of Sigmund, really wanted a sword, and he asked the dwarf Regin his foster father Regin to create one sword that was fitting for him, but this could be done only on the third try, when he actually gets the pieces of the sword from his mother. And a lot of deeds are performed with the sword, such as slaying the king Lingvi, who in his turn slayed Sigmund, his father, then slaying the dragon Fofnir, then beheading the foster father Regin himself, and in other episodes as well. The sword is characterized by elemental forces. It also seems to be flaming when it is used, and the trial refers to the fact that he managed to split the anvil with it and then tested it with a tuft of wool. He cast into a stream against the stream, and then he managed to cut it in two. So in this point, he's very certain that he is going to accomplish his mission. He actually does not want to go on the mission without this sword. And there is also a prophecy about it, which is the fact that Sigurd's name would endure if he is going to use this sword, which is his rightful inheritance. So in this case as well, we can notice a symbiosis with the hero by performing all these deeds. My third example will be Skofnung. Skofnung is a sword that appears in a lot of sagas, especially in the saga of Hrolf, but then its story continues somehow in other sagas as well. So Skofnung also has a personality of its own, defined by, for example, sharpness or hardiness. It seems to have autonomy and to be alive every time it is used. For example, sverdi skofnur bítur og nest hann hot í þeirra hásum en nattu raskofnungs var sú að hann kvað við hot þó hann kendi beinana. So Skofnung bites and clangs against the skulls, for it was in Skofnung's nature to sing aloud whenever it tasted bone. So not only is it a hardy sword, but it can also perform other things as well, such as singing, or this is with reference to the noisiness of the combat, but also it involves this idea of animacy. So this is a thing that we find referred in the chapter 50, for example, of the saga of Rolf Kraki. And its story continues in Laxdøla saga, where there is a conditioned transfer of power. We have a man called Skeggi who plunders Hrolf Kraki's burial mound, and then he has a fight of his own with an outlaw who murdered the son of a man in his jurisdiction, and he is able to use the sword because he respects the magical recipe, so to speak. It should be kept out of sunlight, which he actually does, and then he can use the sword. And not only this sword also seems to have a further living element attached to it, a healing stone that he actually uses to save this man, so he does not end up killing him, as a matter of fact. Another episode involving this sword, very interestingly, in Thordar Saga Hredu, we have here an ambiguity of agency. We have an episode where Thord actually wants to use, he sees the sword, he thinks it's very brilliant and good looking, and unsheathes it, but he cannot help himself but to kill a horse with it. One more compelling episode regarding the sword would be in the saga of Cormac. This does not go very well for our hero. It could have also been a part of the identity building of the warrior, but then again, here we have a certain ritual that has to be adhered to, and this might sound a little strange in the saga, but he actually had to keep the pommel out of sunlight, like in the case of the saga of Laxdøl, of the people of Summer Valley. And not only this, he also had to ensure that the little snake coming out of it would go back. So he really had to handle the sword properly, because if not, there would have been a discrepancy between the activity of the warrior and the activity of the sword. And eventually that happens because Skofnung broke from where the gutter ridge ended the moment he engages in a duel. So losing the duel actually confirms the lack of harmony between these two agents, and as well enforces the animacy of the sword. There are many more examples in saga literature. I'm going to give you just a couple of them. We have the sword Lövi that can only be wielded thrice, just like Tyrfing. It cannot be unsheathed without killing, just like Tyrfing. And the sword is gripped to Bodvar's arm. This was also a champion from the saga of Hrolf Kraki, which makes it very difficult to steal. And this shows us kind of like a fusion with the hero. Another example would be Snidil, described in the sagas as the best of all swords. It is used to kill a monster with swords for fangs. In the saga of Egil the One-Handed, we also have a very interesting example. Here we have a very interesting symbiosis, as a matter of fact, because this sword is attached to his arm. It is a sword that can grant him victory, but interesting thing is that it is fastened above his wrist so that no one can withstand its blow. So here we can see very clearly the example of hybridization and of the harmony between sword and hero. The last example would be from the saga of from Göngukrol's saga. It's an episode of combat between Grimr from the retinue of King Eiríkr and King Hreggviðr. And here we again find this theme of the sword biting. The sword bit as if it were striking water. And a description as well. The harness was adorned with gold where it was deemed necessary. And in the back of the sword's hilt were embedded life stones. So again, an example of personhood and of the sword actually coming to life. Such examples can also be completed by others in skaldic poetry. There are a lot of kenningar of metaphors regarding swords in skaldic poetry, about 460 of them, and they can be grouped in a couple of categories regarding their descriptions. For example, the reptilian character is prevalent in many of them. This character of being unexpected or sly, just sliding when you least know it. And you have, for example, things like the tester of the battle eel, or the tested shield rim salmon, or the snake of battle, the battle serpent, the snake of strife, the reptile of corpses, the adder of wounds, the serpent of wounds, and so on and so forth. So anyway, something related to snakes, eels in that category. Another category I found was the comparison with plants like reed. So these are sturdy plants. They're also noise producing and very hardy. For example, hard-hammered reeds of battle, sharp wound leeks, trees of the din snake of Gondul, Gondul being a Valkyria, or blood branches. The third context I found is actually inanimate, but by judging by how dynamic this is presented, with reference to embers or flames or ice, frost, and so on and so forth, like these elemental powers of nature, we can also conclude that they would have been perceived as somehow animate. For example, the flame of the weapon noise, or the tongues of the gilded tongues that sang. The question that remains would be regarding the relationship to archaeology, like if that what we can find in literature regarding personhood and animacy can also be somehow retrieved from archaeology. And I must say that in this field of study, there have been recent articles dealing with it, and researchers have come to the conclusion that medieval swords maybe were not as physical or as socially static as we have represented them so far, because they have a couple of ancestral qualities that can maybe also be retrieved from the graves. Looking, for example, at the way they are placed near the warrior, looking at what has been done to the sword afterwards. For example, we have a lot of cases of swords being bent. That would have been perhaps a metaphor of killing the sword, to take it with you in the realm of death in hell. Or maybe some other significance. At any rate, the position and possession of swords in graves could indicate a more complex martial identity than assumed before, and also this idea of the charismatic property of swords. And we have a couple of examples here of compelling swords, especially with regard to their hilts, like the sword from Dybbek, or the sword from Steinsvik. And this can also be represented artistically. We have a couple of examples of sword pommels, where you have these very intricate decorations with the gripping beast motif, or with ribbon animals. So archaeology can retrieve some mortuary practices that can also contribute to personhood. It can manifest itself in the merging of the body imagery with swords within a performative context, since the objects were positioned by mourners who had to climb into the graves themselves. And I'm quoting Sayer here. All right, as a preliminary conclusion, I would say that swords can be, or certain swords can be regarded as merging with individuals, or in themselves be considered individuals, based on several aspects, having a name, first of all, then being bestowed a property or a voice of their own, and then having some kind of agency, like altering events, or at any rate taking part in an event in a very decisive way, having a mythological quality, and having material qualities that evoke notions of life. The very active role of such objects pose a challenge to the human object boundary, according to the new thing theory. So we can regard warriors as a hybrid compound. In this sense, humans reconfigured as a complex organism encompassing its own environment, in the case of Old Norse source, with warriors integrating the weapons in their own ecology, and personhood functioning as a flow of elements. That means the inanimate can be integrated into the animate, and we can also consider the medieval use of swords as a site of dynamic networks of natural and supernatural landscape, where we can notice a fusion with inanimate objects, posing a questioning of the self, and where agency and animacy are actually split between the object and the person. That would be it so far from me today.